Today I'm going to be talking about space again. That's why we got the space background. We're going to be talking about the new space race to the moon. So many of us weren't alive with the last space race to the moon. And of course, that was so much political. It was during the Cold War. Well, really, even though there's a lot of talk about science, we're back in the same situation. So I'm going to share the details with you and kind of a cool little personal story coming up. My name's Alejandro Rojas. You're watching the Alejandro Advantage. I'm a journalist and a media producer, so this is based off of one of my recent stories. But real quick, be sure to subscribe if you like these videos. I'm putting out a lot of videos these days, and I hope you're enjoying them. It looks like people are. If you want to be notified when a new video comes up, you also have to hit that little bell button down there. So do that real quick and then we'll get going here. So like I said, this story is based off of one of my articles and also kind of this fun event that I got to go to. So here's the article, how Russia and China ignited the new space race to the moon. You don't hear a lot about that. You hear a lot about, it's for science and how it makes sense that we go back to the moon as a stepping point to Mars. Not everybody agrees with that. In fact, several astronauts have said, no, that's a terrible idea. It takes way more resources to get to the moon and then go to Mars as opposed to just going straight to Mars. However, there's a reason, and of course politics is involved. Just like the original space race to the moon, it was during the Cold War, it was us versus Russia. Well, now we're back in that same situation. Let me show you about it. But let me show you a sciencey kind of thing first here, which is really interesting. And that is, we don't have rockets that can take us to the moon anymore. Why is that? Well, when we changed our focus from going to the moon to orbit, you don't need as big of rockets just to get into orbit. So the rockets we have are much smaller. Now here's what NASA hopes to build, the Space Launch System. And you can see the difference between the Saturn rocket, which is just absolutely humongous. I'm going to show you some perspective on that in just a minute, to the new SLS rocket. So the newest one, the one that they're going to fly first, that they'll hopefully be testing next year with the Orion capsule on top, which is supposed to eventually take humans to the moon and Mars and elsewhere, is smaller than the rocket that we used to take to the moon. Here's a different configuration, where it adds another stage, and you can see this configuration is a little bit bigger than the Saturn. But just to show how impressive the Saturn missile is, here's some more pictures. This is from a Reddit, and you could see it stacked up against other rockets. This is interesting here. So SpaceX, they're going to be the new company taking us to the space station, because the Soyuz right here, the Russians have used to take us, they're no longer going to take us anymore. Our contract with them is running out, so we need a new rocket. So what's next? The Falcon. The Falcon is already, this is a SpaceX rocket, already taking cargo and supplies, and next year it's going to take humans. So this is exciting. This is going to be a big step where finally the United States has a solution to take our astronauts into space. This is a Blue Origin rocket, just so you're aware. This is a rocket that Blue Origin, which is ran by Bezos, who Forbes says is the richest man in the entire world, he hopes to take humans to space using this rocket. So hopefully their plan is next year to actually have a capsule that you can take a ride in, and they'll take you into space for a minute. I'm going to have another article coming out about this, and I'll do another video on all of the space tourism stuff coming up. And you could see all of these rockets are much smaller than the Saturn V. Now, the rocket that Elon Musk hopes to take us to Mars in the next 5 or 6 years, that's this one, the Interplanetary Transport System. You can see that is quite bigger than the Saturn. But let me show you this, because this is where my story starts. And this was last December at Marshall Space Center, which is where I went to get involved with Space Camp. So I'm actually wearing this Mars t-shirt. Space Camp was to promote Mars, or, they brought some journalists there, National Geographic, to promote this Mars television show, and One Strange Rock, and that will all pertain later on here. But this is a Saturn rocket that they have inside of this space center. And in fact, we were there that night. There was this important gala to commemorate the Saturn V's last trip to the moon. We'll talk about that in just a second. But this thing is absolutely humongous. This is just the back end, and it goes and goes and goes forever there. But let me show you this one. This shows you some perspective. So you can see how tiny people look compared to those giant rockets on the Saturn. This is the dinner we had, the gala, right under the Saturn. So just the cone is above us here. But here you see another capsule that's on display there. They've just got so much stuff. It's really cool. You got to visit it if you're in visit Alabama, or take a trip out there. It's worth it. But at the end of the press conference, we were able to talk to this guy, Harrison Schmitt. Why is he so important? Well, Mr. Schmitt was the last guy to walk on the moon. So here he is, Harrison Schmitt, with his fellow crew members on the Apollo 17 mission, the last mission to the moon. So Harrison Schmitt was like one of the last guys to set foot on the moon. Here's another picture I want to show you. That's really cool. This is them on the moon, on driving around, the little lander. Pretty cool there. I love this imagery. Because there was some news in December. People were talking more and more about the Chinese and the Russians going to the moon. And since we had this opportunity, I asked Harrison Schmitt during that press conference if he felt that all of this talk about going back to the moon for Russia and China will kick off a new space race. Well, he said, I think it has already started. He told me China certainly has committed itself to be a dominant spacefaring nation. We need to be sure to recognize that and become competitive even more so than we are today. Then, this was December 7th, which was, like I said, to commemorate the Apollo 17 mission. Well, just a couple days after that, on December 11th, here is Harrison Schmitt standing next to the president as the president signs new directives for NASA to go back to the moon. Real quick, too, this is another astronaut here. This is Peggy Whitson. In fact, I interviewed her not long ago as well. You could read that story on Den of Geek. And in that story, essentially because Peggy Whitson and Scott Kelly, another astronaut, are the two of the people who have spent the most days in space. So this one was about, hey, can we actually spend time in space? Wasn't it kind of rough out there? So they both said, yeah, it's doable, but difficult. So that's who Peggy Whitson is right here. She's a remarkable person. All the astronauts are, but she's great. So, yeah, Harrison Schmitt was there just a couple days later signing this thing. NASA now is going back to the moon. And as you can see here, they call it back to the moon and on to Mars. So the plan is here to get that Orion capsule out to go to the moon, fly the SLS, that's the rocket that I was showing you, the Space Launch System, the large one that's supposed to get out there that'll fly next year for the first times, and also work with commercial spacecraft such as SpaceX. So then eventually they also want to build a space station called the Gateway, and all of this will lead to a launching pad to get humans to Mars. That's the plan. Now, some of this is figured out. A lot of it isn't, because this is a major change. We were going to go straight to the Mars. In fact, the SLS and the Orion, that's what they were working towards, is to get us to Mars. Now we're going to go to the moon first, build this space station, maybe build bases, all of that sort of thing. But why? Why are we doing this? Why is this such a big deal? One of the things that they've talked about is the reasons we want to do it is because of science. Here's another story I wrote about lunar water ice discovered on the moon recently. So this is really helpful. If we're going to send people to Mars, they need to have resources such as water. Water can be made, of course, to drink, but it can also be made as something that can produce energy. They can separate the oxygen and the hydrogen. There's a lot of great things you can do with water. So this is big news, and this helps for the idea of us putting people on the moon in the future. However, here's the big reason, of course, we're going to the moon is because Russia and China have plans to go there themselves. So here's the history. Sputnik goes up. Russia puts up the first satellite. That's what kicked off the space race. Everybody was freaked out. China, the United States, that's when China and the United States kicked off their space programs. China's did not do so well. It took them until 2003 to actually get a human into space. Of course, in the United States, we beat Russia to the moon, and we haven't gone back in quite some time because there's just not that political or even really, there's scientific reasons, but not enough to warrant that. So we've just been in Earth's orbit. But China's going to the moon. They are sending this rover to what is commonly known as the dark side of the moon. It's actually the far side of the moon. Someone had pointed that out. It's not really dark, man. You shouldn't call it that. Well, yeah, but that's commonly what we call it. And he's right, that it's just the side of the moon that we can't see, because the moon, only one side faces us. And there's another side, and China, for the first time, is going to be sending a rover there. So China's program is really kicking up. They've had a couple space stations. They're small, in orbit. One of them made some news when it fell back to the Earth because they were worried that it would land on people. Luckily, it did not. But China's space program is really kicked into high gear. In fact, astronaut Scott Kelly, who I was referencing earlier, said this not long ago. He said, "I think that China will overtake the U.S. in the space business if we allow them to." So he's an advocate that we got to really start rolling on stuff if we don't want them to pass us up. But Russia is also on the moon, on the move, soon to be on the moon. They are planning to send humans as well. In fact, Putin said that they want to, in the 2030s, put humans on the moon. So Russia's been talking about going to the moon. So what does that mean? It means, of course, we need to go to the moon. This is interesting, too. This is just how SpaceX has kind of taken over the U.S. launching, rockets or getting people to the International Space Station from Russia, and Russia seems to kind of have surrendered that. But, the U.S. market is pushing so hard towards these space programs, and part of the new directives that the president gave were to work with commercial space and work with them to take care of a lot of this heavy lifting, so to speak. Here's the issue. This is the big issue behind the scenes. Who owns the moon? So why is it such a big deal that we get there first? Because really, whoever gets there first is going to have a lot of leverage on what can be done where on the moon. This is a conversation with a space lawyer from July 29, 2018. Who owns the moon? And he mentions the 1967 Outer Space Treaty here, which established that the moon and space is a global commons. And what they mean by that is, as long as anybody that goes from any of the nations that are part of this treaty to space, that they will make sure that these people are permitted and that they are law-abiding, that they'll follow the laws when they go into space. And when they get there, they can do essentially, whatever their government has permitted them to do. The difficulty there is then it doesn't talk necessarily about ownership, and it's very vague. And not everybody is sure they're going to be following, these treaties when they get up there. One of the big things, and in that Mars television program that I was talking about, they really tackle this in the second season, is mining. If we're sending private companies into space, like SpaceX is doing that so they can start to ferry people back and forth for money. And if miners are saying, we want to go mine stuff on the moon, will you take us to the moon? Sure enough, they'll do it. But what is the legal framework as to whether or not they can mine on the moon and where they can mine? And essentially, the theory is, which is probably correct, and here's the fear, is that whoever gets there first is going to be able to have their pick of wherever they want to establish themselves or their businesses. So my big message here is that there's, as usual, the reasons we're going back to the moon are more complicated than you may think, and we really are in a brand new space race up against Russia and China, just like the olden days. And as soon as next year, we won't even be working with Russia to ferry our people up to the ISS. We'll be relying on SpaceX, possibly other American businesses to do that. So the relationship between Russia and the United States has been very strong in space, but that is beginning to change as our relationships here politically seem to not be working out very well. So it's going to be something very interesting to watch. But what's really exciting about this, especially for those of us that are space enthusiasts, that what happened with the last space race, it really kicked off the whole space program and got all of these new technologies into development so that we could, have spacecraft and get people to the moon. This current iteration of this could result in humans having a colony or a base on the moon, humans having a colony and base on Mars, but beyond that, also having regular transportation back and forth between these two celestial bodies, truly making humans a multi-planetary species. We're going to be traversing more ground than just our Earth. Extraordinary. Mind-blowing. Thanks so much for joining me for this. I hope you enjoyed this talk about the moon and us getting to the moon. Definitely check out and keep up on these stories. Follow me on my Twitter to follow more space news, or my Facebook. I have the links below. And please do subscribe. Hit that little button down there and the little bell so you can follow my other stories. But thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, take it easy.